Good morning, craftspeople. It's great to have you here. Weather outside is horrible. I've got a cold, but that's not gonna stop us. A friend of mine brought me along to disassembly of a workshop, and the guy there basically made me a good deal. And I've decided to do something good additionally for him and wanted to make a knife. And I thought a friction folder would be kind of nice because he's a little bit older, so I don't want to make a fixed blade for him. A fixed blade being a blade that you cannot fold, basically it's fixed into the handle, and a friction folder I'm going to get to in a bit. Yeah, and I've decided to do that. I've yesterday drawn out the rough plan I want to do, and I'm going to make that knife from one of the files I got from him. This is a little bit blunt, so it's not terribly shame if this one goes to a different project now, and yeah. We'll get cracking with that. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for coming along, and have a nice warm tea. If you have this kind of weather as well. Enjoy. Okay, a friction folder is basically a knife that has like a little tail on the blade end, which is going to be this little part right here. And you have two handle scales, and inside of these handle scales this knife will rotate, and while it turns open, the little tail it has will slide into the gap that is formed between the handle scales, and through its friction it's going to hold itself in place there. This is going to be the shape of the handle. I've got a little bit of finger groove right here. The two holes are one for the stopper pin and one for the actual pivot. Now, I'm going to make that out of an old file. Isn't really good for much fighting anymore. But this is incredibly hard material, so I have to anneal this before, and since I've not got the right setup, I'm just going to do a pseudo anneal of throwing this in the forge, heating it up, and then letting it cool down in sand, because that's the slowest I can make it basically. And when you usually anneal a blade, you want to keep it at a certain temperature and then drop it by very specific amounts of temperature in a very, very slow manner to soften the steel up. Because right now I cannot drill holes in this file, and I need to actually be able to fix the pivot in it. This is basically what this friction folder is going to look like once it's done. This is at least the rough design I've got. And you open it by basically pushing this tail down, then flipping it around, and there's a second pin right here, usually, that is going to stop the blade from rotating further. And you have this little notch right here, basically, that when you look at this hole, it lines up neatly with this hole when it's closed. And when you open it, this basically also lines up so that the tail is right on the edge of the wood and then locks into this pin then. I have these three wonderful, nice Cocobolos, which are going to form the handle scales of this knife, because I really like Cocobolo. It's got beautiful contrast once you've put some oil on it, and I feel like it is really easily finished and feels pretty good in the hand. And it's also going to make a nice aesthetic to the roughness of the file, I believe. So this is what we're going for. Handle scales usually come flat from the manufacturer, but they're not precision ground or anything, so these are not going to be perfectly flat. What you can do is take a flat surface. This is like some really precisely cut wood for that purpose. Put some sandpaper on that, and then basically just do the good old handwork, flattening it out. You just have to be really careful to always match your strokes, so you don't just like do it without a system, because that way will lead to rolled over edges and non-flat material. I flattened these scales. You can easily check that by holding something very flat against that and then holding them against the light. And if there's no light shining through, you can be decently sure they are flat if the thing you're checking it against is actually flat. Next up, I've got this piece of aluminum. It's quite thin, I'd say like around 0.7 millimeters. And this is going to be glued inside of the flattened part of these scales, because wood will tend to wear on friction folders. I unfortunately don't have any little piece of steel that I could use for that, but I think this is going to do quite fine, and especially since we're going to use a file which is going to retain its texture, even though it's a banked old-up file. I think it's better to reinforce the wood basically with something a little stronger. like to drill all my holes if I do a stock removal knife, which is going to be a knife that you just grind out of the stock you have. I like to drill all my holes while it's still a surface I can clamp properly and well. This is what we've got right now. We've got the holes next to each other. From the other side you can see there's still a bit of space in between, and the one that's closer towards the edge is gonna be the knife that will stop at the pin basically. Okay, next up I'm going to cut off as much as I can with an angle grinder, because that's going to save me time with the grinder. So, after cutting most of this off with the angle grinder, this is where we are right now. You can see I've left it oversized in pretty much every dimension, just so I have a little bit of wiggle room when I go to the grinder, and I don't have to worry about maybe already having to determine myself in one area. The only area I did not cut oversized by accident actually was the top part right here, but this is still pretty bang on the line. So I think it's gonna be fine. Next up I'm going to move to an old 40 grit to knock off the edges, because those dull off your belts pretty quickly. And afterwards then I'm going to jump straight to a fresh 40 grit, roughen these bevels, get them to 80 grit finish, and then afterwards I'm going to harden this thing. I don't know how far we get with this today, but let's hope we get a decent bit of work finished. Meanwhile the epoxy is drying. It's still gonna take like an hour more to properly set, and then we're gonna get ready with that. Okay, let's go. We've got the old 40 grit on there, gonna cut up the edges and then gonna go on with a fresh one to get as quickly through this as possible. Alright, we've got the blade profile. I've got it clamped in the vise right now. Next up I'm going to take some files and get this profile of this tail. So, we've got the blade as far as I want to go before actually having the handle scales done. Next up I'm going to grind in the bevels. All the way up to a clean 120 grit finish. It's very thin, it's not yet sharpened though. And next up is going to be me unclamping these pieces and then drawing on the handle scale or the way I want it to look, and then figuring out all the mechanical parts before actually attaching the knife. This looks pretty good. I've got a little bit of glue coming out on the sides, but it feels pretty solid. And next up I'm going to flatten these pieces out a little bit, just so there's like some shmoo on here that I can get off really quickly. And then I'm going to draw on the shape of the handle, and then we can properly get on the holes in here and prepare to make this into a handle. It's been a while since I've shown you the progress on this knife. Basically what I've done is I've taken the handle pieces, drilled through the pins for the top part. The black line is going to be the shape of the knife, and you can fold it out like this. It stops right there on the pin, and when I close it up, it stops on the inside pin again. Next up is going to be the wood grinding, and afterwards it's just like fit up, clean up, glue up, and then we're done. Since we spoke the last time, I've just gone ahead and cleaned these handle scales up, so now they are nice and smooth. They have not yet been coated with oil. I've sharpened up the blade. It will shave hair off my arm. So this is the blade now. I will give you a little bit of different light, and here's beautiful Coca-Cola wood. Next up, I've got these 4 pins that are, those are 4mm fitting in these 4mm holes. Next up is just the assembly. Then I'm going to pin the pins over, which means I smack them with a hammer lightly so they mushroom out a bit, which is going to also get me a mechanical bond in this. And I'm also going to put a little tiny bit of epoxy on that. Afterwards it's just cleaning up the potential squeeze out of glue that's going to come out, and also any little flaws that are still there, any bit of hand sanding that might need doing on the handle, so I get like tiny facets out that are still in there. And yeah, let's do that now. We take these pins, they are rounded off at the end, which is always pretty handy when you try to fit something up into a hole without using brute force to get it in there. Next up, I'm going to just drop these pins into their determined holes. Just to dry fit it. This is the little bit of tiny frickly work where you mustn't use much force, because else you might break your handle scales, as they are decently thin at this point. So always try to keep square and even pressure on the pins you have in there. That looks pretty good. Everything fits, everything lines up nicely, it opens, closes, a decent bit of friction. That friction is also going to increase once the pins are pinned over, because then they exert a little bit of more pressure on the top right here. Alright, I really have to be careful with the epoxy not to actually glue in the blade itself, so I'm going to be really conservative with the amount of epoxy I actually put on these pins. It's mostly going to be held in place by the pinning of the pins, to put it correctly, and that means I don't actually have to put in massive amounts of epoxy at all. It's just a little bit, so it holds up tiny bit better, and that's going to be it. As you can see, I'm decently careful with it. I move it in and out so it's actually fitting really nicely, and already I'm removing the glue from the outside, so there's not going to be any squeeze up, and I'm only going to pin the pins once the knife is actually, or the epoxy is actually glued up and dried all the way. Epoxy, it's nice to know, does not bind to any surfaces that are actually full of grease, so I just covered it in a tiny bit of wax, going to make this a lot less sticky to it.
Alright, that's how I made this little friction folder right here. I hope you enjoyed it. This was just a side project, basically a little interlude, because I wanted to get this knife out for someone who made a really nice offer for me after their workshop disassembly, and that's why I put it in between and not after the Viking project, because I wanted to finish this till the end of the week to give it to him. I hope you enjoyed this. It's pretty sharp. I already cut myself with it accidentally, and I really like how the cocobolo comes out, and the file is subtle enough so it's not garish in my opinion. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to leave a like, a subscribe or a comment. I'd be really grateful for any kind of feedback you might give me, and I hope you enjoyed it. Until that time, see you, have a good day. Thanks for watching.